On today's video, we're going to find out why there are literally no homeless people living in the Florida Everglades. At first thought, you might think alligators and of course mosquitoes, no-see-ums, and horseflies would be enough to deter anyone from wanting to live in the Florida Everglades in the outdoors. But there's actually more than meets the eyes to the reason why, despite the Florida Everglades being kind of an empty area, the homeless people would never try to live there. And on today's video, we're going to find out exactly why. And sure, there are a lot of invasive animals like giant monitors and lizards and of course snakes like pythons and boas in the Everglades. But this isn't some crappy clickbait video. I'm actually going to explain to you the real reason why being homeless in the Everglades is literally impossible. The first thing is that I have spent countless years, if not decades, exploring the woods and Everglades in Florida, and I have never once encountered a python in the Everglades. So the people that make these videos saying there's pythons everywhere in the Everglades, do they exist? Yes. Are they that common? Absolutely no. I lived in Naples, Florida for over 20 years. And I only once saw a python, and it wasn't in the Everglades. It was in a trailer park off of US 41. You're more likely to encounter rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and other snakes that are actually native to Florida, but are absolutely much more dangerous than a python. So the notion that there's these giant pythons out there that are going to eat people is simply not true. You're more likely to encounter a rattlesnake. So like I said, on today's video, we're not dealing with fiction, we're dealing with the real reason why you could actually never live in the Florida Everglades as a homeless person. As someone who has spent 20 years of their life exploring the Florida Everglades, quite literally the most obvious reason why you could never actually live improvised in the Florida Everglades is because cottonmouth snakes would eventually come to your camp, and then you would die from a bite from a cottonmouth. Now, the cottonmouth situation would just be a matter of time before you unfortunately stepped on a cottonmouth and died from its bite, because if you're living in the Florida Everglades and you're attracting animals, most likely your homeless camp would become a place for snakes to want to go into, and eventually you would die from a snake bite from a cottonmouth. However, if you are able to find higher, drier ground, then your homeless camp would get infected by rattlesnakes. Even if you could dodge the most obvious threat, which would be the fact that unavoidably your homeless camp would attract snakes that would kill you, the next factor is that the Florida Everglades are heavily patrolled by game wardens, and in these parts, bringing in garbage, pollution, or anything into a natural habitat like the Everglades, with the amount of Florida wildlife presence that there is out here, you would literally get kicked out for sure. But even if you didn't get kicked out, if you were somehow able to dodge the fact that the Florida Everglades is literally one of the most patrolled regions in the entire country, there's probably some sort of military activity as well out here, which means that your camp would undoubtedly be found eventually through heat-seeking radar. On top of the fact that tourists venture into the Everglades and get lost all the time, which means they're constantly sending search crews out there to look for stupid tourists who get lost in the Everglades, your camp would undoubtedly get discovered. And when it does get discovered, there's not a chance in the world that these government agencies in the Florida Everglades are going to allow you to stay there. Even if you were able to hide in the most remote wooded area, eventually you would be found accidentally in a search for a lost person that was exploring the Everglades, or simply some other type of surveillance activity. Here in the Florida Everglades, they're constantly looking for somebody who's lost, and they have technology like seeking radar, heat sensory crap on helicopters, which means that it would be literally impossible for you to hide out in the Florida Everglades and not eventually be discovered by law enforcement. This region of South Florida is part of the HIDA, the high-intensity drug trafficking area, which means that local law enforcement gets extra resources to patrol this area and make sure that there's nobody hiding in any of these wooded areas because, again, it lends itself perfectly for illegal activity, something like Border Patrol along the Mexico border is present here as well to a smaller degree. And with those extra resources from HITA, law enforcement is able to constantly patrol this area. So the notion that you're just going to hide out in the woods and never be discovered in the Florida Everglades simply doesn't exist. Now, I've had a few people over the years email me and ask me why it would be impossible for you to live homeless in the Florida Everglades. These are people who probably have warrants and did something horrible and think that they can go hide out in the Florida Everglades. What they fail to notice is that this is actually one of the most patrolled areas anywhere in the United States. I've been miles off of a paved road deep into the Florida Everglades thinking that there's nobody around watching me, and it turns out that there are game wardens on your trail. Then you have the constant revolving hunting seasons. Basically, the logistics of setting up camp undiscovered in the Florida Everglades would not happen. It would probably take less than 2 weeks for somebody to discover you, and that's a generous time frame. Simply, the logistics of being out there undiscovered do not exist because people actually try to get into the most remote parts of the Everglades and get lost and then have to be found with heat-seeking helicopters on a regular basis. Keep in mind you are between Miami-Dade County and Collier County. These are law enforcement agencies that have a lot of resources. So logistically, it would be impossible for you to hide out in the woods and not be discovered. And this isn't like when you get caught on private property somewhere else in Florida. If these are protected natural wildlife areas and you were to bring garbage and contamination here and think that you're just going to set up a camp in an area that's protected by the federal government, you have smoked yourself retarded. But even if you could dodge that situation, the reality is that it's not just snakes and game wardens that are after you here in the Florida Everglades. There's something even more menacing. If you were able to find a piece of land that was high and dry, it would be prime black bear habitat. Black bears in the Florida Everglades can reach as much as 600 pounds. Now, weather in South Florida is 2 seasons. You have the wet season and the dry season. And towards the end of the dry season, black bears are hungry and desperate, especially if there's a delay in the weather pattern. Literally, your camp would be inundated with black bears trying to get a hold of anything to eat. Thus, you would eventually be attacked and killed by a black bear. And this isn't some hypothetical thing. Quite literally, towards the end of the dry season, when there hasn't been rain and there's no food to be found, the black bears get very desperate. And if you had a camp inside of the Florida Everglades, you would literally have dozens of black bears on your trail trying to take your food from you. That would literally bring you to your death. Okay, how long have you lived out here?
30 years.
Okay, what's it like living in the middle of nowhere?
Crazy. It's bizarre, man. You got all kind of wildlife out here. You got bobcats, panthers, bears.
All right, you've seen panthers?
Oh yeah.
How many times have you seen panthers in your life?
I've seen 3 times. I've seen them 3 times up close, you know, cross the road in front of me and just be out relaxing, and they come out and sit in the road and look at you, and they go back into the woods.
So let's say living out here your whole life, you've only seen 3 times panthers?
Yes.
Black bears are more common?
Oh yeah, very common, man. And they'll come in your yard and they'll actually come up on your porch and smell through your door and go out and tip your garbage can. You go out, holler at them, they just look at you like, you got something for me?
Yeah, how big do they go? Like how tall?
Oh man, the biggest one I seen was probably about 600 pounds, 650.
What?
Huge. And it still roams around here at night. I mean, I could take you over here and you can see some garbage in the bushes where he drags it over.
Burmese pythons do exist in the Florida Everglades. However, this is really not a realistic threat for you if you're homeless. Could it happen? Absolutely. But the Burmese python isn't going to pose an imminent death threat to you if you're camping and living as a homeless person in the Florida Everglades. The panthers, however, will. Now, the state actually tracks Florida panthers with telemetry, and it's no surprise that the counties that have the lowest homeless population also happen to have the highest Florida panther telemetry. Now, while there haven't really been that many Florida panther attacks recorded in the state of Florida on humans, if you were to live there in the Everglades and presently be trying to hold a homestead or a campsite in the Florida Everglades, eventually these Florida Panthers would get brave enough to try you. In other words, if they see you one time and whatever, they might just be curious and investigate you. Now, these Florida Panthers are very inquisitive. They're very stealthy. They're downright creepy, and that many times the Florida Panthers will see you and stalk you, but they won't actually show their face. They're very good at hiding. They'll stalk you, watch you. You'll walk on a trail, you walk back on the same trail, you'll see their footprints, and you never saw them, but they're watching you the whole time. And if you were present at a campsite in these isolated regions, eventually a Florida Panther would definitely try you. So yes, it hasn't happened, but trust me, if you were to set up a camp in the Florida Everglades, you will eventually have problems with Florida Panthers. A lot of people would think that an alligator would be the number one threat, and an alligator would definitely be a threat. For one, again, Florida has a wet season and a dry season. During the dry season, alligators venture from place to place looking for water holes that they can go into. But during the monsoon, when everything floods, they look for the high ground. And if you're in the Florida Everglades, high ground is very difficult to come about, which means that if you're able to find a little island in the middle of the Everglades of a high land area, that area would eventually be a place where alligators would want to nest. So you would eventually have alligators coming to your campsite thinking that it's a high, dry area where they can nest. And alligators are usually never going to bother humans, with one exception. If it is a mother alligator and she has little babies, that alligator will literally kill for those babies. The only time I've ever actually been attacked by an alligator was when I was on a creek in the Crew Swamp, and I happened to venture into a baby alligator nursery. Me and my friend from Maryland were fishing on a canoe, and we looked around and we noticed that there was baby alligators everywhere. We made a plan to escape, but the alligator eventually did attack our canoe, almost tipping it over. This is about the only time the alligators will actually go after you, is if you actually have to venture into an area that is one of their nurseries. And this would definitely be a problem if you're looking for high ground to set up camp, is the alligators would eventually consider your campground a place that they would want to nurse because it's high and dry. Obviously, one of the biggest necessities for homeless people is access to clean water, and clean water does exist in the Florida Everglades. However, bathing would become quite literally a challenge, as you could not really venture into any source of water in the Florida Everglades without the constant threat of there being cottonmouths or alligators present. Finding water is definitely one of the key resources that you will need if you're homeless. However, finding water in the Florida Everglades means that it's going to come along with other critters, and alligators would definitely always be present in that clear water. I do believe you should have no problem finding water in the Florida Everglades. Obviously, there's a lot of mosquitoes, no-see-ums, and infections, and eventually you would probably die from an infection. The amount of mosquitoes, no-see-ums, horseflies, and insects that are out here in the Florida Everglades would literally mean a certain death eventually, unless you were absolutely meticulous about the type of clothing you wear. But there are times of the year, like especially after the rains, when the first mosquitoes come out, where literally every square inch of your body would have 2 to 3 mosquitoes trying to bite you. It is literally almost impossible to survive the mosquito season in the Florida Everglades, and mosquito season that is literally year-round and definitely worse during some parts of the year. The most difficult part of living day-to-day life in the Florida Everglades as a homeless person would be the heat and humidity is relentless, and it is year-round. In the southern tip of the Florida Everglades, temperatures can be as much as 30 degrees warmer than anywhere in Central Florida. So if it's like in the 30s overnight in Central Florida, it'll still be in the 60s down here in the Florida Everglades. Before the sun rises, humidity is already at 100%. The humidity in South Florida is unlike anything you've ever experienced in your life. Now, I've lived in Alabama where temperatures usually get as high as 109 degrees. Despite the fact that that is a lot of hot weather, the problem with South Florida is the humidity. It's a level of humidity that you're not going to encounter anywhere else in the United States. And yes, I've been to Texas. Yes, I've been to Arkansas. Yes, I've been in Alabama during the summer. Yes, their temperatures do get in excess of 110 degrees. The problem in Florida is even if the temperature's in the upper 80s or 90s, the humidity is at 100%. You're surrounded by low, shallow water. The humidity here is literally unbearable, and living here would eventually become an absolute nightmare if you do not have access to air conditioner. I would even go as far as saying that eventually the fatigue from humidity would actually lead you to some type of debilitating health condition, which could eventually, with the combination of mosquito bites, fevers, lead to a health condition similar to a state of malaria that could literally kill you, because it is literally that bad. I do not want you to underestimate how bad the humidity is in these areas, and that living here without access to air conditioner could quite literally debilitate you to the point where it becomes a life-threatening situation. It would literally come to your personal DNA and how strong your body is to resist the humidity. If you are a light-skinned person or come from a Scandinavian background, chances are you would eventually become so debilitated that you would not be able to survive in this habitat. Literally, a lot of people that come here are able to somewhat manage. Other people simply won't. Depending on your personal genetics, chances are you have a good possibility that you would literally dehydrate yourself and literally fatigue yourself to death with the humidity that is unbearable, unrelentless, and only disappears for a few brief windows during the winter time. Keep in mind, if you live in Sarasota, Tampa, or Orlando, the humidity down here is present during the winter as well. Once you go a little bit north of the Florida Everglades, the humidity disappears for the winter time, areas that are inhabited. But out here in the Florida Everglades, the southern tip of Florida, the humidity almost never goes away. That combined with mosquitoes and infections would probably get you to the point where you would become so weak and fatigued that you could become so ill it becomes life-threatening. There is, however, one scenario where you could survive in the Florida Everglades, and that is if you could find a camp in the mangroves and somehow be able to keep the mosquitoes and no-see-ums off you. If you're able to find an island in the southern tip of the Everglades, you may be able to have access to an unlimited supply of food. The Florida Everglades have a high concentration of fish: snook, sea trout, sheep's head. The list is endless of the amount of food sources that would be available to you if you are somehow able to have access to maybe a boat and go fishing for subsistence. Of course, that opens up another realm of possibilities. If you're able to find an island near salt water where you could fish for subsistence, then you would be in danger of running into an American crocodile. Assuming you were able to protect your body from the mosquito and no-see-um bites, you could literally carve out a living in the Florida Everglades if you depended solely on subsistence fishing. Thus, if you found a mangrove island that had a high ground, you could set up a camp there. You would literally be able to live in the Florida Everglades from subsistence fishing. The question then would become access to fresh water. You would have to create a cistern to be able to collect water during the rainy season so you could survive during the most difficult dry season of the year. But then eventually a hurricane would come and you would die in a storm surge flood. This really becomes the problem with the Florida living situation if you're homeless in the Everglades, is that eventually if one thing doesn't lead to death, another one will. And definitely if you're able to somehow survive off subsistence fishing, you would eventually run into the problem literally when a hurricane did come through, whether it hits the East Coast or the West Coast. The Florida Everglades is at an elevation of no more than 3 to 4 feet above sea level, and when that storm surge comes up, you would literally be engulfed by the Gulf of Mexico, and thus, if there were to be a hurricane, even if you were able to escape the hurricane's immediate effects, you would not be able to escape the storm surge flooding. Your camp would literally flood, all your supplies would be destroyed, and if you don't die directly from the storm surge itself, you would die from the fact that the storm surge flooding would literally destroy any ability you have to keep any food or any supplies you have dry and safe. Even if you were to make some type of treehouse or elevated living situation, once the storm surge comes through and floods everything, your entire camp would have to be at a significant elevation to avoid the storm surge flooding. But even if you could somehow get everything off the ground and away from the storm surge flooding, which could easily be 4 to 5 feet above ground level in a case of a strong hurricane, you would still have strong winds that would destroy your tents and camping situation. The combination of the storm surge below you and the winds on top would mean that your camp would really, literally be destroyed by the hurricane. And as the storm surge flooding would increase the water level, all the insects, fire ants, would eventually crawl into your camp, which means you would have thousands, if not millions, of fire ants trying to hold on to your camp or your living situation. Which, by the way, do not forget the threat of fire ants. Eventually, your living situation would bring ants to you, and these fire ants would quite literally eat you alive. Fire ants would eventually become a problem, but even if you're able to keep fire ants away in the case of a flood, your camp would have to be far up above the storm surge to survive. The ants would eventually crawl into your camp, and now you would have an absolute death situation. Thus, living in the Florida Everglades as a homeless person is quite literally impossible. Eventually, something would kill you. A hurricane, fire ants, snakes, panthers, black bears. You would eventually be discovered by law enforcement, and even then, life would be so miserable with the heat and humidity that you would wish a black bear would eventually take you out. I do believe that most likely you would succumb to some type of infection. You wouldn't be able to keep the mosquitoes off of it and the bugs, and eventually that would be your cause of death via infection. I do believe that that would be the number one and most likely way that you would die, since after all, you are living in a swamp surrounded by water, mosquitoes, and insects with no access to anything. Let's not forget that there's literally nothing in the Florida Everglades. Most homeless people in the United States are going to have to be at least a few miles from a store or a convenience store. And the problem is that in the Florida Everglades, the only gas station that existed eventually failed. Thus, even the grocery store here is out of service. You could be as much as 70 miles, 40 miles from a grocery store. That would literally mean that living in the Florida Everglades without access to a grocery store means that you would be 100% dependent on subsistence fishing. Farming wouldn't even be a notion in the Florida Everglades because of the constant monsoon season, the flooding, and of course the poor soil quality. Farming wouldn't be an option. Your only options would be subsistence fishing. And even if you could survive that, most people who are homeless need access to a gas station. The only gas station anywhere in the Florida Everglades is currently abandoned. Now, there are efforts to restore this gas station. I believe they started cleaning it up and they're going to try to open it again. But literally, without access to a grocery store, you would have to be 100% self-sufficient in access to food. Now, while subsistence living through farming wouldn't work, you could definitely survive by fishing. There is enough food for you to survive in the Florida Everglades. A storm or several days of rain or even a hurricane could stop your ability to gain access to food for long periods of time, and storing these types of foods unless you salt them is literally impossible. Thus, we can see that the logistics, again, of living in the Florida Everglades would include challenges like being as much as 50 miles from a grocery store to buy a simple piece of food or water. At every single second, you would have to be on the lookout for predators, whether it's big cats, black bears, alligators, and snakes. At no time while you're hunting, fishing, or just sitting in your camp would you be able to be distracted or not pay attention to your surroundings, because again, you are living in the wild. Bobcats in particular are very curious and they stalk you as well, and there's no shortage of bobcats in the Florida Everglades. Now, there wouldn't be enough time on today's video to exactly elaborate on all of the wildlife challenges that you would face, but I'll give you this clip from a recent homeless camp that I did to give you an idea of some of the unique things that you're going to encounter in the Florida Everglades and these remote parts of Florida that you probably won't encounter somewhere else.
I have seen a spotted leopard a long time ago, a baby. I don't know where it came from.
Yeah, like pet industry probably or something.
I don't know. But she was gorgeous. It was actually, it wasn't these woods, it was the woods up there.
Okay.
It was in the middle of the night, pitch black. Thought it was a house cat.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have my phone at the time because it was pitch black and I couldn't take a picture of it if I wanted to.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was literally about from this tree right here.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't this tent, but it was literally that close to, and she was perfectly poised up the tree.
Now, that doesn't mean that there are not homeless people that live on the edge of the Florida Everglades, like this campsite that we discovered in Florida City in the outskirts of Miami is right on the edge of the Everglades. And this camp illustrated clearly how living in this part of the state would be an absolute miserable affair. Obviously, the mosquitoes are consistent. They don't get off you. But the worst part that I noticed wasn't even the mosquitoes. It was the fact that your droppings, your human waste, would eventually attract horseflies. And the horseflies have a tremendous bite and sting. It would literally be every second of your life would be absolute misery unless you had proper clothing to protect yourself from the plague of insects that would eventually find you. Surviving here in the wintertime may be possible, but I do believe that in the summertime, when the floodwaters come up, eventually you wouldn't even be able to move through these swamps. Living in these places in the Florida Everglades is literally impractical, if not impossible. And I will have to say that probably the reason why there are no real homeless encampments in the Florida Everglades is because life out here will be so difficult that you simply wouldn't survive. Now, I've been to homeless camps in north central Florida and all along the state of Florida, and there's places where the mosquitoes are unbearable, and many of the things we've talked about today are realistic threats that the homeless people have to deal with. However, in the Florida Everglades, the flooding or the storm surge would eventually destroy everything you have when the coming of a hurricane comes through. And of course, if you're living out there, unless you have a radio that you can crank up, chances are you'll be completely incommunicated of information from the outside world. No access to grocery stores. Living in the Florida Everglades would be not only impossible, but quite literally, if you did survive, it would be some of the most miserable existence that a human could carve out on the face of the earth. If you could survive the onslaughts of the wet season, you would face new challenges during the dry season, and perhaps the wildlife in this part of the state would eventually bring your life to an end. But again, even if you were somehow able to stay alive during this entire process, your life would be nothing more than a hot, soggy, miserable existence. And this is why there are no homeless camps in the Florida Everglades. There are people living homeless in the Florida Keys and in the mangrove swamps throughout the entire state of Florida. The living conditions here are abhorrent. However, they don't have to deal with the constant wildlife threat. And these areas are usually right outside of large cities where they still have access to anything they need. In the Florida Everglades, most people would simply die. Somebody who has intimate knowledge of the land, the season, the wildlife, and many of the natural aspects that revolve around living in the Florida Everglades would have the preconceived ideas necessary for survival and the foresight to anticipate the dangers and threats of creating a camp and living in a camp in the Florida Everglades. For one, if I were going to create a camp in the Florida Everglades, it would definitely have to be at least 8 feet off the ground. Without a doubt, your living situation would have to be a tree house. Now, finding a large tree in the middle of the Florida Everglades would absolutely limit your options, since there's only a few places where those large trees exist. Most of the Florida Everglades are marshland, or if you could find a palmetto island where you could use the palm trees as some type of base, you could possibly do that. But without a doubt, you would have to have an elevated living situation, and it couldn't be exposed because of the winds of hurricanes. This would all mean that your options of how you would be able to survive would be endlessly limited, back to back, on all the things you would need. I think it would be possible to survive in the Florida Everglades, but you would have to know exactly the location. You would have to first find a high ground area, create a tree house, perhaps in an area that has Australian pine trees. Someone like myself who has enough knowledge of the land could think up of ways that you could actually survive in the Florida Everglades. you would definitely need to be near a source of salt water. Perhaps if you could find a seashell mound along the coast, you would definitely need a cistern and a boat to survive out here. The amount of, you would need many things that would be almost impossible to take out into the Florida Everglades. So the idea would be that you would have to have enough resources on hand to begin with. The notion of creating enough resources, cisterns, boats, canoes, with the notion of taking them out into the Florida Everglades to try to survive seems literally impossible. Perhaps some of the shorelines along the Everglades southern edge, these are undisturbed natural... Whoa, lightning strike. Whew. Okay. Welcome to Florida. Like, literally, I just saw a lightning strike right in front of my building. That was scary. There's the thunder from it. Yeah, Florida is a scary place, and I'm sure you could improvise ways to live clandestinely in the Florida Everglades. Most likely, it sounds like a bad idea, and I think you would eventually die. So basically, if you have enough intimate knowledge of the land, you would know the types of places and settings. A sandy area near a mangrove with access to water with tall trees that you can somehow create some type of treehouse living situation. But the vast majority of people that are homeless simply do not have that much intimate knowledge of the land where they can find the resources they need and create the adequate living conditions. Most likely they would encounter death far before they would ever figure out how to safely live in the Florida Everglades. And then you would still have to deal with a 650-pound black bear trying to kill you. That is why there are no homeless people in the Florida Everglades. Henry County's homeless population is currently at 4, and this is still a county that has roads, businesses, and access to utilities. Further into the Florida Everglades, living in these wild areas without actual human conveniences means a certain death. Even if you were able to find a dry, high area with pine trees that you could use to build things, you would still eventually succumb to the notion that a storm surge would flood out the entire place and you would lose all your good things. Could you bring out solar panels out there and propane tanks? Then you would need a car. You're 50, 60 miles. Are there people living deep into the Florida Everglades with absolute military precision in camps like this? It's possible, but these individuals would have to have a very intimate knowledge of the land and have to be 3 to 5 miles from civilization at most. There's no way you could venture beyond that point. Are there individuals living on the fringes of the Everglades, somewhere in Naples or somewhere in Miami or Broward or Palm Beach? They would have to be on the outskirts of civilization, venturing purely into the most remote regions of the Everglades, thinking that you're going to be completely self-sufficient out there is an absolute death wish. Would you guys like to see me try setting up a camp in the Florida Everglades? I've always had the idea of camping in the Florida Everglades. Of course, I would have to bring the right resources. Wouldn't that be a cool video for our channel? I think we should try that in the future. You guys have been wanting me to try the homeless experience. Of course, I'm not going to do it in an inner city homeless camp where there's people coming in there and robbing you. That's not going to happen. But I would like to one day camp out in the Florida Everglades and learn more about could you literally sustain yourself in the Florida Everglades. Living out there like that would be an interesting topic for a future video. Literally, the Florida Everglades is one of the most inhospitable places in the United States, and these are just some of the ways you could die living in the Florida Everglades. But the first settlers in Florida actually did it, and those that did it in the Florida Everglades were along rivers and areas that were exactly the way I described. They had access to saltwater for navigation and sustainable fishing resources, and they found an island that had a shell mound, which means that they could somehow survive on the mainland. But many of those camps eventually succumbed to the notion that hurricanes destroy those camps. That is today's video on surviving and living in the Florida Everglades, and I hope this gives you an idea of why criminals with warrants don't just run out into the Florida Everglades, and if they do, they'll probably want to wish they got turned in and went to a prison, because quite literally living in a prison would be more comfortable and more survivable than life in the Florida Everglades. It would just be that miserable. And I know a lot of people have asked me, should I try this? I'm thinking about being homeless in the Florida Everglades. Yeah, just turn yourself into law enforcement. It'll be a much more comfortable ride. Besides the fact that unavoidably you will get caught, because again, they do monitor these areas with helicopters, heat-seeking devices, and all types of technology to catch idiots like you who think they can run into the Florida Everglades to escape. the law. There is a crap load of people with warrants hiding in Florida homeless camps, but they're much better off doing it in a suburban setting where they can hide and kind of be in the fringes of civilization in one of these homeless camps. All right, so I hope that answers your question of living in a homeless camp in the Florida Everglades. Is it possible in the outskirts? Yes. Deep into the Everglades? Literally, no. That's why it doesn't exist. Now, if somebody literally is living deep in the Florida swamps in a homeless camp, completely incommunicated from society, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It definitely could. They would still have to be somewhat within urbanization or close enough to where they can supply themselves directly from human transportation, not nature itself. I really doubt that there's people out there that are literally living that savagely. Now, there are people that live pretty close to that. I remember when I lived in Lehigh Acres, Florida, I was driving my ATV through a flooded swamp in Lehigh Acres, and there was a guy, which I called Tarzan, that lived in the woods. He did wear nothing at all, and he would just sit there with his beard and pretty much almost nothing on. Sometimes he would grab a t-shirt and wrap it around his loin. This guy was literally living savagely, and I would venture around his camp, and he was fishing and eating turtles. And that's how he was surviving, catching fish and turtles. And I guess every once in a while he would resupply on fishing gear by breaking into people's properties and stealing fishing lines. So that there's literally no way he could actually acquire these things in Lehigh Acres without burglarizing properties. But again, there's the lifeline back to an urban area, stealing from people to get fishing line and equipment that he would then use to rig up things to catch turtles and fish. So he was still somehow, despite the fact he was doing subsistence living, attached to urbanized areas. But solely depending on nature out there, it's possible. It would be a very difficult existence.